Hey, I'll check out the audiobook of Lew Rockwell's Fascism versus Capitalism, narrated by me, Scott Horton, at audible.com. It's a great collection of his essays and speeches on the important tradition of liberty. From medieval history to the Ron Paul Revolution, Rockwell blasts our statist enemies, profiles our greatest libertarian heroes, and prescribes the path forward in the battle against Leviathan. Fascism versus Capitalism by Lew Rockwell for audiobook. Find it at Audible, Amazon, iTunes, or just click in the right margin of my website at scotthorton.org. All right, y'all, Scott Horton Show. I'm him. Check out the archives at libertarianinstitute.org/Scott Horton Show. And sign up for the podcast feeds there and all that. Follow me on Twitter at Scott Horton Show. All right, introducing our friend Andrew Cockburn. He wrote the book Rumsfeld, His Rise, Fall, and Catastrophic Legacy, which is no overstatement. And he also wrote the book Kill Chain, and a bunch before that about Iraq and about weapons back during the Soviet days and all kinds of things. And he is something or other, senior something at Harper's Magazine, Washington, what is it? Bureau Chief?
Washington editor.
Washington editor, there you go. At Harper's Magazine, The New Red Scare is the cover story for the December issue. The New Red Scare, Reviving the Art of Threat Inflation. Welcome back. How you doing, Andrew?
Hey, Scott. Good to be with you.
Good, good. Very happy to have you here. Wonderful article. It'll be the spotlight tomorrow on antiwar.com. I'm running it today at the Institute site. Yeah, it's really great here. There's all kinds of things to it, but I guess if it's okay, let's do like you do here and talk about a little bit of history and just how dangerous these nuclear weapons are, because I think you and I may have spoken about this aspect before, that ever since the fall of the USSR and the end of the official Cold War, nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons issues and the clear danger of them hanging over all of our heads, it's really just kind of fallen to the back burner. Nobody really thinks about them or talks about them very much, even including politicians, but especially just among the regular public. It just seems to not be an issue. So maybe you remind us why you think this is such an issue in the first place here.
Sure, because we, as you said, they haven't been an issue since the end of the Cold War, because people kind of imagined, reasonably enough, that it's all gone away, that we'd had these thousands of missiles pointing at each other, for nuclear missiles, for years and years, and now that the confrontation was over, surely they would have been packed up and put away. But in fact, that didn't happen. They were kept in their silos, a lot of them, and some there was a reduction, but there was still, enough to blow up the world a few times over. And they were kept on ready alert. They were kept on basically, ready to fire if the moment anyone thought, there was a good idea to do so, if they thought the other side was attacking. In fact, that nearly happened, I think, in 1994, when the Norwegians fired a weather rocket into the upper atmosphere, and the Russians thought this was an incoming strike, and they were thinking about launching. And that happened many times during the Cold War. So, we've remained much more than people realize in this state of terrible, sort of hair trigger alert and terrible sort of risk. All the way, from that day till this. So that's and then we go on now. These maniacs are talking about, they are modernizing the entire force. They're going to build a new ICBM and a new bomber and a new submarine launch missile with a new submarine to go with it, and more satellites. And it's, it's all about money, but it's going to make the situation even more dangerous if that were possible.
All right, now talk about that, because in the article you say that it was the negotiations, we actually covered this at the time, is the negotiations over the New START treaty is what led to this entire new $1 trillion+ project to revamp the nukes?
Exactly. That's why these arms control talks are really pretty dangerous, because they always lead to some initiative like this. What happened was that Obama wanted a foreign policy triumph, like they all do, and arms control treaties are meant to be a good thing, and he talked very piously during his campaign about abolishing nuclear weapons, and he made a famous speech in Prague in March 2009 about how his goal was to abolish nuclear weapons. So, okay, he gets his treaty, which is to reduce the arsenals on both sides by not that much, by a bit, and to not build certain kinds of weapons. But then he had a problem because he had a Republican Senate, and so he had to get it ratified. It was a treaty after all, and the only way he could get it ratified, get the the Senate Republican representatives of the arms lobby to sign on to this, was to promise them what has turned out to be $1 trillion nuclear modernization plan. So, in order to get this treaty he could boast about, we have many more. We have newer, allegedly better, and unfortunately more usable nuclear weapons, which is very disastrous.
Yeah. Well, all right. Now, so, well, let's go ahead and get right to the worst part of the article then, as long as we're there. The more usable nukes. They also, as you talk about, they've been sailing battleships, these Aegis cruisers, or however you're supposed to say it, right? I forgot. Aegis cruisers that they've sailed in the Black Sea and in the Baltic Sea that have provoked the Russians into flying their jet fighters and buzzing our ships very closely. Donald Trump, at one point, the new president-elect, even proposed shooting those Russian planes down for buzzing so close. But there's a lot more to that story that is not in the usual newspaper pieces about it. Can you explain about that?
Sure. So, I mean, we have to go back a little bit more into history. The end of the Cold War, it was sort of agreed, or the Americans proposed to the Russians, said, okay, you let us unite Germany and put Germany in NATO, and then we promise that you pull all your troops out of Eastern Europe, and we promise we won't expand NATO into Eastern Europe. They broke that promise. They did expand NATO into Eastern Europe, right up to the Russian border. So now, when relations took a turn for the worse in recent few years, all these little countries that were now under the NATO umbrella and were, demanding that we show we show support and everything. So we've been sending these, not very many, Aegis actually destroyers, and an Aegis destroyer is the Aegis system is an air defense system. It's meant to shoot down airplanes and even maybe missiles with these Aegis missiles. Okay, so they're sailing around in the Baltic and in the Black Sea as well, actually, I suppose, to reassure the Ukrainians. But the problem is that these missiles or missile launchers look, although they're designed and intended allegedly just to shoot down planes or missiles, they actually look exactly like cruise missiles. I mean, the launchers, cruise missile launchers or cruise missiles themselves. So the Russians looking at them saying, well, we don't know if these are just defensive weapons or something that could reach Moscow in a few minutes.
Well, and I think you say in the article, it actually is the same launcher. It could be used. It's a so-called dual-use launcher. It could be a nuclear-capable cruise missile.
Electronics, but that's all. Uh-huh. So they're identical to all intents and effects. So this is extremely scary for the Russians. So they've been taking very aggressive, measures. They've been buzzing them, as you said, and they've deployed more submarines in the Baltic and in the Black Sea to counter them, ready to sink them if it looks threatening. So now the Americans are sending more anti-submarine systems, aircraft, to counter that. And now, actually, just it was after my article went to press, the Russians have now deployed their sort of tactical nuclear or short-range nuclear missiles in Kaliningrad, which is this area between just on sort of in the Baltic. It's sort of cut off. It's a Russian base on the Baltic. They deployed the Iskander missile, which is a nuclear missile. So you've got this slow escalation sort of going on with no one paying much attention. It's extremely scary. And if something went wrong, someone accidentally hit a ship or whatever, the balloon could go up.
Mm-hmm. Well, and so that's the thing here. You quote this guy, Bruce Blair, who used to be a nuclear forces officer, I guess. And he's saying that what's going on here, what you just described with these Aegis cruisers being nuclear capable and looking like maybe they're pointing nukes at the Russians the way they are, that this is actually being done in a situation where the Americans are basically unaware of what it is that they're doing or how it is that this looks to the Russians. And he says, nobody's paying attention on the National Security Council, no one at defense. So they just do this, but I'm trying to scan here for the word here, but like basically we're just blind here. This is just the government machine rolling along, and no one is really taking into account the context that you just explained here.
Exactly, and Bruce Blair, he was for many years he was a launch control officer in a Minuteman silo. He sat there with one other guy, and they were ready when the orders came to turn the keys and launch 48, I think it was 48 from memory, nuclear, intercontinental missiles towards Russia. So he spent a lot of time sitting next to and there was one nuclear missile sitting right next door to where he was. So he's thought a lot about this, and he's thought a lot about how he runs an organization called Global Zero, and he's thought a lot about how easily all this stuff can be launched. And that's why he's so freaked out at the moment at the way, we have these ships and planes playing games in the Baltic. But, with, as you said, unimaginable consequences, imaginable actually consequences. I mean, something could go wrong and suddenly we're in a nuclear war, and no one, none of these bozos in the Obama administration, I certainly wouldn't expect anything better from the Trump administration, sort of seem to have know little and care less about what's going on.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's the whole thing of it. Here's the quote. He says, we're in a low-grade nuclear escalation that's not even necessarily apparent to ourselves, and ourselves meaning the eyes of the U.S. government that's doing the escalation, that they don't really have the imagination, I guess, to see the other side's point of view and the context within which they're really operating. They're just doing what they're doing, and everybody else better look out, and it's as easy as that.
It's truly frightening, So, it's a very scary situation indeed.
All right, now, so Trump's won, and the headline yesterday is the best headline I've seen since, it's really even better than the phony reset with Hillary Clinton and Medvedev because, one, it was just Medvedev and not Putin, but two, it was Hillary Clinton, and you can't count on her, man, unreliable, and of course she completely botched that reset and was never held to account for it, but lost anyway, thank goodness. But anyway, so now Trump has said, nah, screw that, let's get along with the Russians, wouldn't that be nice? And I'm sure not for, allying with him in Syria or anything like that, just for picking a fight. But doesn't it look like, even despite the whole national security state, that this is one thing that Trump really believes in and means to implement, that we are backing off Russia, whatever exactly that entails?
He may well, I'm prepared to accept that. But the problem is that he is... it's like someone sort of, trying to sort of, someone in a canoe trying to tow a supertanker around. He's got the enormous weight of the national security state, which is violently opposed to anything like this. And I'll give you an example. I mean, today in Senator John McCain, chairman of the Armed Services Committee, saying that he's announced publicly, he said any attempt to reset relations with Russia is unacceptable. He said, McCain went on, with the U.S. presidential transition underway, Vladimir Putin has said in recent days that he wants to improve relations with the United States. We would place as much faith in such statements as any other made by a former KGB agent who has plunged his country into tyranny, murdered his political opponents, invaded his neighbors, threatened America's allies, and attempted to undermine America's elections. So there you have it. That's and so all the people, or pretty much all the people that Trump, the rumors say he might put in the job of running the Defense Department or the State Department, are all sort of, tend to be mad dog, cold warriors. I mean, John Bolton, that creepy little fellow, who, he's a sort of demented, on the demented end of the neocons. Rudy Giuliani, this this weird sort of, wannabe cop.
And as ignorant as Donald Trump himself, really, Giuliani.
As ignorant and even sort of, just as nasty, if not nastier. Mike Flynn, I don't know, General Flynn, he sounds kind of crazy. But
yeah, and he co-authored a book with Michael Ledeen.
Well, there you go.
Yeah.
There you go. In the face of all that, I mean, Trump himself, what he certainly says about Russia is, eminently reasonable and sane, and cheering to the all good-thinking people like you and me. But when he's up against the McCains and the Boltons and the Giulianis and the who's that other fellow? Oh God, I can't remember his name. The former head of the CIA. There's another nutcase he's talking about putting on.
Felix Rodriguez.
No. He'll just be back at the waterboard.
Anyway. Wrong Rodriguez. Felix Rodriguez is George H.W. Bush's guy. I'm thinking of the torturer.
Yeah, I know.
Rodriguez.
The Rodriguez, the torturer.
Sorry.
Yeah, we're getting old.
I know. I'm feeling it.
So, your question is the important one. Can Trump do it? He might do. I mean, he might do. He's got to do it fast before they sort of sap away at him and put, present him, provoke incidents. So that turns him against it. But he might do it. But my betting is against it. He's, apart from anything else, the military-industrial complex has got a huge shopping list. There's the nuclear modernization we talked about. That's $1 trillion. Bigger army, bigger navy. And Trump has promised that. He said, he's going to increase the army to 540,000 men, 1,200 fighter plane air force, 350 ship navy. So, but to deliver on that, you need a threat. You can't just sort of say we're going to have it to sort of march around in parades. Really confronting a bunch of sort of terrorist thugs in Syria and northern Iraq doesn't quite do it. You need to do better than that. You need something bigger. A nation state, a big nation state. So it's either Russia or China or both.
Hey, Scott Horton here to tell you about this great new book by Michael Swanson, The War State. In The War State, Swanson examines how Presidents Truman, Eisenhower, and Kennedy both expanded and fought to limit the rise of the new national security state after World War II. If this nation is ever to live up to its creed of liberty and prosperity for everyone, we are going to have to abolish the empire. Know your enemy. Get The War State by Michael Swanson. It's available at your local bookstore or at Amazon.com in Kindle or in paperback. Just click the book in the right margin at scotthorton.org or thewarstate.com.
Yeah. All right, now, so you talked about, it's funny the way you talk in there about even adjusting for inflation, how with all the spending during earlier days in the Cold War at least, you got some ships for your money. I mean, sure, they were do-nothing floating fortresses basically made to destroy wealth, no question there, but at least you had some to look at or something to test nukes on. But nowadays, the money just goes nowhere at all. Tell us a little bit about some of these bigger projects where they literally had nothing to show for it at all at the end. Well, and I mean, besides handing Iraq over to Osama and the Ayatollah.
That's right. Well, my favorite is the Army had a system they were working on for years called Future Combat Systems. And this was a sort of techno fantasy of there was going to be all these, a whole army division or more would be all linked together by communication. There'd be networks of computers and incredibly super duper accurate shells and missiles. So that at one point they said the tanks wouldn't even, or the vehicles wouldn't even need armor because our stuff would be so accurate that we would wipe out the enemy before they could fire at us. Anyway, it never worked. It never showed any sign of working. And finally, in about, I can't remember, 2009 or 2010, after they'd already spent $50 billion, and that was just on paper, just drawing things on in computers and on paper, they hadn't actually built anything. It got canceled because the projected price by that point had grown, I think, to something like $250 billion. But before that, they actually, when they were still trying to get money out of the Congress for it, General Casey, who was then, I think, the chief of staff of the Army, actually took a mock-up, had them park a mock-up on the mall in front of the Capitol, in front of Capitol Hill, and go and announce that this was it. This was a completed, this was an example of future combat systems. It was it was just a fraud and a lie. But that's one. I mean, the Army's got a whole host of them. That they, we're spending all this money. I've forgotten. They've got a thing called the European Renaissance. I can't remember what it's called now, but some program which they're spending $3 or $4 billion a year on at the moment to bolster forces in Europe, and that's amazingly turns out to be one brigade, an armored brigade, which will go to Europe occasionally. Overall, out of this army at the moment, I think it's 480,000 men, and we basically can deploy. If war breaks out tomorrow, we've got about 12,000 men ready to fight. I mean, 12, two, maybe three brigades that are actually ready to fight.
Yeah, let me guess, 2/3 of the entire army are generals and their staff, right?
Oh yeah. We have more. I think I say in the article, I think it's like 12 four-star generals.
The whole thing is just a big welfare program, basically.
Exactly. Just by comparison, I should say, we fought most of World War II with just 4 four-star generals. They promoted a few more at the end of the war when it was over. But basically, we got along with this millions and millions of men, with just 4 top generals.
And you say in here, too, that, and, maybe this gets written off as like, the $100 hammer and the $600 toilet seat and this kind of thing, but you talk about really billions and billions of dollars being spent designing and maybe doing prototypes of endless numbers of different kinds of guns, artillery pieces, tanks, and armored vehicles of every kind that anybody can ever dream of, that we don't even really know how much money they're really spending on guns that'll never fire. I mean, projects that go on for years to develop some kind of replacement for the Bradley or something, but then they never even make one.
Right. Well, that's the juiciest part of the operation. And if you start building something, first of all, people might notice that it doesn't work.
Like the Bradley.
And secondly, you have to buy the metal and then, pay the workers. It's much more profitable to be just doing R&D and studies, because then you can really rake in the dollars. That's an important part of it all.
See, I think regular people, they just can't imagine a system working like that, because no business can run like that, where they do all R&D and no actual sales to any customers. Well, that's going to bankrupt the old man pretty quick,
I'm not saying they don't want the thing to go into production. I mean, they do, but it's quite okay just to be doing R&D, because you also make money on production, obviously. But when you say they don't know how much money they're spending, that's literally true, because the Pentagon famously hasn't passed an audit, or hadn't had an audit in 30, 40 years. They have no idea where all the money goes. We give them close to $600 billion a year, and they cannot tell us what they spent it on. I mean, you can say, well, yeah, there's an aircraft carrier, they must have spent a few billion on that, but there's no actual account. There's no way of getting into the books, or they won't, certainly not doing it, to say exactly where the money is. Okay, we gave you $1 million here to spend on that. Did you spend $1 million? We don't know.
Yeah. Well, and this gets back to Trump and his position here. I mean, it's not like he's Ron Paul the peacenik. I mean, he's basically he's kind of a Rumsfeldian in a way, right? I mean, you write in the book about how for Rumsfeld, he's not really anything. He was just deciding politically what to be, but he decided to be a right-wing nationalist, and that's sort of what Trump is. And so he could be just as dangerous as isolationist in that sense. But it sounds like with this big of a military, like Madeleine Albright said, you got to use it for something, or by the end of 8 years, people are going to start talking about cuts,
Yeah. I mean, people have talked about cuts the last 8 years, but
even during
said it's been happening, but it hasn't really.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they had some sequester. Did that ever amount to much at all, or what?
No. I mean, they say, the military bleat about, how there've been these terrible cuts, but they haven't really. Just what's been cut, in 2012, just before the sequester came in. The administration was saying we're going to spend, God, I can't remember now, XX on defense. and then they haven't spent quite that much. So the only cut is down from future expectations, as opposed to spending less money than you did last year.
Yep. Speaking of Ron Paul, that was a perfect quote of him. That's how it always is with everything. All cuts are only a reduced rate of growth ever.
Right.
That's
right,
DC. Yep. Now, so listen, you talk about Ukraine in here, and this is the one that I think is the most important. And I know, audience, I'm sorry, forgive me, I'm a broken record on this, but it's the most important kind of thing. I talked with Mark Perry, who's a colleague of yours, Pentagon reporter, and I asked him, hey, man, the generals, when they talk about Ukraine and they talk about Russia, at least in the back, room when they're smoking cigars and drinking whiskey and stuff, they admit to each other that they're liars and that they know that America did 2 coups in 10 years and that they're the ones who picked that fight and that no one was killed in the taking of Crimea and that, all the leaks and claims about Russian invasion of Ukraine never really happened beyond whatever tens, maybe hundreds of special forces, but certainly not thousands and thousands of infantry coming like that. They know they're lying. They're just making money, right? This is about money. We're going to sell some big ticket items and we're going to have some good cushy golden parachutes when we leave the force and all that, right? And Mark Perry says to me, no, they believe their own BS, almost all of them. Like there's McGregor and them who don't really believe in the policy, who therefore don't believe in the threat. But everyone who believes in the policy, McMaster and all the people who want to expand into Eastern Europe, man, you can't tell them that Vladimir Putin is not the new Hitler or the new whatever that must be contained. They believe it. They have to.
Right. Well, that's they have to. It's like someone said to me who worked in the Pentagon that he said he'd never understood how, in the communist countries, in the Communist Party, the party line would shift overnight. We look from, we like Hitler, we don't like, we're peace with Hitler, war with Hitler, or whatever, and everyone would immediately switch. Well, it's like that in the Pentagon. The party line changes, and they all go along with it. You can't get to. It's very hard, I think, to, for people of weak character to get to the top, and I think only people of weak character do get to the top, and maintain a sort of skeptical independence of mind, or independent and skeptical mind about things. So I think Mark's right that they do believe it. That they'll you can brand them with red hot irons, and they'll still say if they're on the F-35 program, they'll say, "Oh, it's a tremendous success," or if they're McMaster, they'll say, H.R. McMaster, sort of rising general, he'll say, "Yeah, the Russians are a terrible threat." I mean, I think they really learn to sort of internalize it.
Yeah. See, torture just doesn't work, even if you branded them with red hot irons. These bastards. I don't know. Turn them over to the meanest guys over at the CIA, and we'll see. But yeah, no, I hear you. It's a real shame too, because the guy George Friedman from Stratfor said that the coup in Ukraine was the most obvious coup in world history. Okay, good. I think we can just go ahead and settle on that as consensus then, since we all saw it happening in real time anyway. You know, there's a great clip of Ron Paul on Fox News where they say, "Ron Paul, how come you keep saying that there's a coup going on in Ukraine and that, what is all this about a coup?" And he's like, "Yeah, no, really, they're trying to do a coup right now, watch." And then it was the next day that they overthrew the government there and the president had to flee all the Nazi thugs in the street,
Yeah.
So anyway, it'd be nice if we had, and I wonder about this, Putin, he's no dummy, right? He's a lot of things, but nobody ever says that he's stupid, really. And so he knows that nobody really wants to have a nuclear war. They just want to sell a bunch of submarines and stuff, right? But then the problem is that maybe it really is worse than that. And I think maybe he knows, because you have people like Carl Gershman keeps writing in the Washington Post that we would like very much to overthrow the government in Moscow, which sounds sort of like the ultimate challenge. You know what I mean?
Well, he's got a new ultimate challenge, because he was, as you say, he was he was the one who most explicitly said what was planned for Ukraine, as I recall, in the fall of 2013.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and said, and you might be next. And he just wrote another one of those for the Post a couple of weeks ago.
Oh, God.
Yeah. So I guess, I mean, that's part of the game, we think, right? They don't really want to fuse hydrogen atoms over our heads or anything like that, but they're trying to get old Putin to react enough that they can point to his reaction, right?
Yeah, yeah.
He cut defense spending last year, and they were all caught grumbling like Fred Flintstone. You know? Supposed to be boosting it.
Absolutely. But that doesn't get mentioned too much, that he cut defense spending. Anyway, it's only less than a tenth of ours.
Yeah. So, well, it's an interesting thing. Now, well, here's something else, though. So Angela Merkel and Francois Hollande, they went over there, and I think they stopped in D.C. and told Obama what they were doing. I don't know if they asked him first or not. But then they went and they cut this Minsk II deal to end the Ukraine war, which has, more or less held. There's been violence, of course, but the overall war is over. So that really raises the question of what our so-called ally, really our satellite states in Europe, think about all of this saber rattling, too. I mean, if there's a war here, the Germans are caught in the middle,
Yeah, I mean, Obama, things have really sort of settled down in Ukraine. I mean, there's still sporadic little bit of violence along that dividing line, but basically it's been settled. The Minsk agreement is pretty much held. But I think the Obama administration, they've kept up the rhetoric because they don't want to make it sound, don't want people to get the perfectly correct idea that Putin has succeeded. Ukraine hasn't turned into a big NATO base, like if that was the plan. I mean, he's going to keep Crimea till the end of time. Putin hasn't done too, but he's handled the crisis fairly well from his point of view. He probably didn't, but the Obama administration keeps up that sort of mini Cold War just because they do, out of petulance. I think they don't want him to seem to have a success.
Yeah. Now, help me out with the date here. Sorry to put you on the spot, but it was right after the Ukraine war broke out, wasn't it, that you had your report that had all the military industrialists having their fancy party and celebrating?
March 1st or 2nd, 2014.
Yeah, just at the very beginning of the war, just as Putin is taking Crimea and all that, they're saying, hip, hip, hooray. It's a brand new day for arms salesmen in D.C.
Yeah, this was described to me as someone who was there. It was a defense lobbyist breakfast in D.C. on K Street, in fact, home of the lobbyists. And all the defense lobbyists were there. And I asked my friend who was there, I said, what was the mood like? He said, I'd call it borderline euphoric.
Right. Wow. Yeah. So that's really the American system. You could call it, ultimately it seems like if you were setting it up as some kind of machine, it would seem like the purpose of it would ultimately be murder, suicide, and then all the corruption and palm greasing is the lubrication that makes all the gears go, even though ultimately it could get us all killed. You have the right vested interests in just the right places to keep it going.
Yeah.
All right, well, thanks very much for coming on the show, Andrew. I appreciate it.
Certainly. Anytime.
Very good to talk to you again.
So. Take care.
All right, y'all. That is Andrew Cockburn. The article is The New Red Scare at Harper's Magazine, and they'll let you pass the paywall for this one special this month. It's harpers.org for The New Red Scare. I'm Scott Horton. Thanks, everybody, for listening. Check out the full archives at scotthorton.org. More than 4,000 interviews going back to 2003 there. And check out the new digs over at the Libertarian Institute. That's libertarianinstitute.org. And the show archives there are libertarianinstitute.org/Scott Horton Show. Otherwise, I'm trolling the War Party all day on Twitter at Scott Horton Show. Thanks, y'all. See ya. All right, y'all. Scott Horton here, and I got a great deal for you. Anyone who helps support this show with a $50 donation or more gets a copy of the brand new Rothbard book, Murray N. Rothbard book, of long-lost essays from 1967 and 68, It's entitled Never a Dull Moment, A Libertarian Looks at the 60s. Murray N. Rothbard, really Mr. Libertarian himself, on Vietnam, conscription, civil rights, LBJ and Nixon, and all kinds of great stuff from back during those times. Never a dull moment, and it's an exclusive. It's not available on Amazon yet. It's an exclusive, so far at least, for listeners of this show, so be the first to get it. Help support this show at the same time. Just go to scotthorton.org/donate. And again, anyone who sends $50 on this way, along with a mailing address, and I will get this book right to you. Thanks. Hey, y'all, Scott here. On average, how much do you think these interviews are worth to you? Of course, I've never charged for my archives in a dozen years of doing this, and I'm not about to start. But at patreon.com/Scott Horton Show, you can name your own price to help support and make sure there's still new interviews to give away. So what do you think? 2 bits? $1.50? There are usually about 80 interviews per month, I guess, so take that into account. You can also cap the amount you'd be willing to spend in case things get out of hand around here. That's patreon.com/Scott Horton Show. And thanks, y'all.